All right. Good morning, everyone. And so we will start with making a mandala offering as a token for requesting the teachings, and then with refuge and bodhicitta for correcting our motivation. Sashi Poki Jun Shimeto Tamri Rabling Shi Nidegyen Padi Sangye Shindu Mikte Owa Gihidroku Namda Shin La Chupa Shoidam Guru Ratna Mandala Tamniyatayami. Chonan Sogi Chonam La Chanchu Badu Dani Kapsuchi Dagi Shigi Betsolagi Dola Benchi Sange Dropa Sho Chonan Sogi Chonam La Chanchu Badu Dani Kapsuchi Dagi Shigi Betsolagi Dola Benchi Sange Dropa Sho
Sanji Chedan Soji Chonum La Chanchu Bardu Dani Kyabsun Dagi Chushi Jeban Dagi Drolampe Sanji Drupara Shu Kangi Tuzini Zone Tawa Tamje Bambicher Tambichun Denze Kodam Kela Chance Lo. Good morning, everyone. Samdras.
Dira Sumba Diaki Jibachen Dirbe.
What it Tata? And Lojuni Muser Sanimachi Lote Gorestra.
And so, good morning, everyone. We have been looking at a text that is called Mind Training Like the Rays of the Sun. So for the Sunday morning sessions, this is what we've been covering for the last few months. Hey, Ishi. One-legged Ishi. Yeah.
Hilda Manchiagi and Kingris Lojuni Muser Namavaya, Tandatsu Karsungu Yabati. Any Kamixe Savatindi Bana. The number Sanji Bigi. Chu Laya Ani Tebachejon Yavinani. And Tebachimbugi took Nyams Shetsu Kurambati. This
And so we've been going for some time with mind training like the rays of the sun, and many of you here that have been to those teachings before already have an idea of what these teachings are about. But for those of you here today for the first time, first off, we're looking at the teachings of the Buddha, what we call the Buddha Dhamma. And the Dhamma that the Buddha taught, the teachings of the Buddha, can be classified either as Hinayana teachings or Mahayana teachings. And here, particularly in this set of teachings, we're looking at the stages of practice of the Mahayana.
These are the Chidan King that take Chembudang Chung Sadi and Samlo Jachung Tony Shagiova. Ani Rikchigi 랭안주지 안서 소소 대원대바도 동한문대바 지기인자 라니게 대와드위야다 라니게 동할세와디 소소라야 톱단 여완자 티시송기 아니 랑기 동할 세야 랑기 대와드위야기 삼리 디 코나단 로 아니 드렁엔텔야 대와충우스 데니지 란자마임바 섬자 탐지기 된 삼치네 대두 당들레니 아니 삼로 땅이 들려야 대와침보스 송구여레스.
And so here we follow the stages of practice of the Mahayana. And so the differences between the Mahayana and Hinayana, well, the main difference is in terms of the extent of one's thinking. And so we begin with recognizing the equality of all living beings, recognizing that everyone is the same in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering and pain. And so when one recognizes that with respect to oneself mainly and thinks that, well, not only I'm seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering, but also I have the right to accomplish that. And follows the teachings as they were taught by the Buddha and puts them into practice, then the person considering kind of what they want to achieve for themselves proceeds to a state in which they do accomplish the happiness that they seek and eliminate suffering. And so that way of thinking is called the Hinayana way of thinking. Whereas in the Mahayana way of thinking, we do not only do that for ourselves, but we also recognize that all living beings are the same in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to avoid suffering and pain. And therefore, along the steps of the Mahayana practice, one is seeking to not only accomplish that for oneself, but to accomplish that for the sake of all living beings.
Terda dinza tewa chembuge samlo shemadi simjan tamje dongar dantana samba simjan tamje dewa dena chimaro sambati ten dewa dembati dagi chigi nyamba dongar sawati ngararangi chetuga chigi nyambi an dichedo sanji kuma tobarcha nyambi lodida an tewa chembuge ta loyi ta zudres ra bege tanganzu lu보다 마서 루난게다 닝다버도 레버다버도 아니 전주고 샘세 디차고레스.
And so the basis of our Mahayana practice is the wish for sentient beings to be endowed with happiness, to become free from suffering. So we think, may sentient beings have happiness, may they be free from suffering. And not only that, we take the next stage in which we think, I will do that. I will make sure that sentient beings become endowed with happiness and will become free from suffering. And for this end, we think, I will become a Buddha. And so this thought that I will become a Buddha for the sake of liberating sentient beings from suffering and making them become endowed with happiness is the principal attitude of the Mahayana. This is, you could say that this is the heart or this is the brain. If we think of those vital organs of the body, then this thought, which is called bodhicitta, I will become a Buddha in order to liberate sentient beings from suffering, to make them have happiness. This is the heart of the Mahayana.
Tirda, tinza, kanji tebachim bichu singendi, champagne drubiach. Ra, zu shengi gyulaya, chambada ninji kiage, ani tabdenya, ani dedukseyage tabdenyati. Di, 대부침비구치 샴페인 제술 드렌도 와서 딘자 간지 아니 비기겠다 셴 아니 집아 로 어딘지 지기 쳐도 콜롱케 아니 소수기 네버칸 여바디 된 조바이나 안 대부침비구치 산지기 추는 그 추약슈디 차가도스다 델레야 콜롱 상부지고로 와서 지금 란된 걱정소로 제치니 아니 랑기 지금 민단 땀다 년다 딘디지 텐디니니 안지 제바이는 티 최차가 말이 뭐도스 그런 남다 지금 토니 아니 소술류가 있으면야 네버칸 여바디 샴페인 드리엘에 딴 드바이나 산지 규치 태버치 규치 약슈 디차고도 왔어.
And so we call it the Mahayana Dharma. The Mahayana Dharma is practiced with the attitude, with the mind, may I be of benefit to others, with an altruistic intention seeking to benefit others. And so in following that, we use methods for generating love and compassion, for giving rise to love and compassion in our mind. We use methods to eliminate the suffering of others and to set them in states of happiness. That is the way of benefiting others. If we think of, in general, the Mahayana attitude is seeking to benefit others. So the way to do that is through developing love and compassion and through using methods for removing suffering, eliminating suffering, and developing happiness. And so it means that the motivation that we use is involved with cherishing others. And so whatever we do with that attitude becomes of the best practices that we can take up, which means that it depends upon our motivation, and our motivation is not hidden to us. While it might be hidden to others, when we assess a mind, inspect a mind, we can recognize what our motivation is. And so the Mahayana motivation, which is involved with wishing to benefit others, is not a motivation in which we seek to make a good name for ourselves, to have a good reputation, to become renowned, to have other people respect us. This is not a Mahayana motivation. To generate the Mahayana motivation, we need to have a genuine attitude which is seeking to be of benefit to others. And through that, whatever we practice is a Mahayana Dharma practice.
Terda di lojonimi yoseki Joja Chani Gubana Chajik di Chagores. And it Chajik di Sanji Kombanduagi Tab Sanji Kombotobalaya. And it Parduchungi Garki the Numun took some seti Chagwanza di Nimbolaya and it Tawan Tartuba and it Tombani topic Sherabti Shani Tikidangarambati and it Tombani Ribala Soba or Digi Songodos.
And so in terms of what we study here in this text, Mind Training Like the Rays of the Sun, the subject matter is developing the state in which we're capable of being of benefit to others. But in order to do that, the text speaks of two matters, or another way of saying that we can divide the text into two parts. So the first part is about developing those states of mind, the wish to be of benefit to others, love, compassion, and so forth. The second part is dealing with the way to remove the things that obstruct us from becoming Buddhas, the way to remove our own obscurations, the obscurations from our mind. And in order to do so, we need to develop wisdom that realizes emptiness. And so the second part of the text explains what emptiness is in order to develop the wisdom that realizes emptiness in order to eliminate our own obscurations.
Tilda, the Tombani said the sondi, and it Tomba Pigita Tomba, Rawang Tomba Dimbadi, and it Tenjin Join Ginzinki, and it Rawang Tomba the Tongsulti, the Shipsabu Shushin, Songores, the Dikar Drugores Laundi, and it Tanganzo Namgi Pig Tani Kang. Chedebade, Pena, and Randa Shin. Ro, Tangan's middle, and it put the pomosella soba. And she, Tushila soba. That didn't tiny man was shoot Gabonabu Mawa Sebo the so. Tending tiny man was shoot Chigoras. Tis so tiny dozo, Dara, and Ransor Shavitoni, and yield the Rawang Tomba imba. 간지 라왕 그 동바임바다 타니 님보티 아니 찍래야 만네바 아니 다가란 태수 그 리바디 다 썰트 된 주고도스.
And as the second part of the text is explaining the way to develop the wisdom that realizes emptiness, then the meaning of emptiness is the absence of independent existence, the non-independent existence of phenomena. And the reason that we use in order to prove that is the reason of dependent relation. And so we come to understand how phenomena exist in dependence on and in relation to others. And this view of dependent relation, dependent origination or dependent relation is very subtle. It is very precise. It contains many details. And we seek to develop an understanding of dependent relation. And we apply that to whatever phenomena we come across. So self and others, male, female, the four seasons, different colors, white, red, and so forth. We live in a world, a conventional world, and we relate to the world using those conventionalities. And when we analyze those conventionalities, we see that each and every one of them does not exist by itself or independently. Whatever exists, exists in relation to and depending upon others.
The Dindi Tony, Sangwanza, Ani, the Rawang Matuba, Rawang Matuba, Penata, Rawang Trumatu, Susagi, Shilaya, and Dardan Sheni Legros, on a Dardan Pumbuni Legros, Pingada Ngai Pumbo said, Ngai Chu said, Tini Lenza, and Nga Sasagi, Sachimush Zende, Ngadia, and Rawan Matubi Surdita, and Kitchenbu Shuchin, this song goes.
And so in investigating whether things exist independently or whether they are empty of being independent, they're not independent, we investigate phenomena such as, for example, ourself and others, myself and my aggregates, which means myself and my body and mind, myself and other phenomena. When we investigate these groups, this classification of phenomena, what we come to see is that none of them exists by itself, by its own power. This is to say, independently.
Tira dinza manzuta namgyugi yondralaya ngala rawang goy sati ro ani sososo rawang laya ani songyu chedi topdan res lagora dina labana shingi ani soso di rawang chubach redu mundu ro ani dieta goyed pe kichimu chagwasares soso pigi Rawang goy singing, Rawang gonging, Rani, and Tambu Trudini, Rawang Trumevayana, and Telea Rawan country ragari said. Dindi some of by energy, Manzugi, Lomang Shuch, the Chongzing Lodre, any Cholong Lomang Shuji, any Todroyach, Medroyach. Di mevayana ani chi chanyambu ne tuya sem di chanyambu ne tuya ji yaja yada ma yungu yores.
And so things that we commonly speak about in this world at present are, for example, freedoms, in the sense of wanting to be independent, wanting to be free person. We regard our rights to be free human beings to be very important, and we fight, we work in order to protect our rights. And so then when we investigate our freedom, our independence, we can get into a really subtle investigation. It's important to investigate our sense of independency. In order to do that, first off, we check the way in which we exist. Do I exist independently, or do I exist independent upon others? And through that very investigation, we can eliminate so many partial states of mind. We have certain beliefs, certain ideas about ourselves, the way that we exist. And we hold some of those ideas to be supreme, to be so important. And as such, we also are subject to many states of partiality. And so through investigating the actual way that we exist, we can develop a mind that is balanced, right? A balanced approach to ourselves and others, which is free from those states of partiality.
되는 간주다 배나 마주가 라원 세지 아니 슈크쳔부 슈크 송구여라서 마주기 라원 약슈디
Much.
마 게제시에 라원
Um,
아니 더 약슈디 가르스레디 무유네 출시토야 장대 시토야디 더 고야디 당간줄라 고야디 데려왔어 딘디게 라원디 아니 수 초그레스 라와이나 로 미신지기 아니 촉투에 빼마스바 카보레스 로 빼마스바 카보레스 더디 간주 귤레 예비게 아니 착당키 로 착당 총롱기 삼바 디왕기 되니 장부체 모토야 장부시에 모토야 무연네수 체모토야 무연네수 시모토야 망부 쇼지 디 촉조거레스 디 삼노기 시자 조데 관리게서디 아니 나우 냠비 나피기 아니 라왕기 여봤다고 차비 로 디기 시자체니 아니 착단기는 촉조고 여바디 당 홍기 깨부담바 남주진도서 아니 탁제원데 덤 디가나 야기도 왔어라
And so, for example, thinking of freedoms, the freedom of speech. And so when we think of what deprives us from freedom of speech, we often think of others as those that might take away our freedom of speech. But there's also an internal factor that takes away our freedom of speech. Speaking about realities, speaking truthfully, in a way that accords with reality, speaking honestly. So what is taking away our freedom to speak honestly, sincerely, truthfully, and so forth? Well, it is our own partial state of mind. Anger, attachment, and so forth operate in our mind in a such way that we cannot speak honestly or truthfully with others. We cannot speak freely, that is to say, with others. And so, the inability to be truthful, to communicate truthfully and honestly and sincerely and so forth is based upon the mistaken sense of self, or the distorted sense of self that we have. And because of that, anger, attachment, and so forth arise, which again take away our ability to speak honestly and freely. And so the great masters of the past have explained to a great degree the false sense of independent existence that we have with respect to ourselves. We kind of, the notion of self that we have, or we are, is as if we exist independently by our own power. This is the basis for different afflictive states of mind, anger, attachment, and so forth, which in some sense deprive us from a certain freedom of speech, to speak correctly, honestly, sincerely, genuinely, and so forth.
제가 간주 야고 상당외너라 당간 세븐도 소소소 상야고 상외나 간주에 착과사지다 착사지다 당사지 매바이나 참마 지규직다 두와이나 야제야다 망고연에서 시에는 로트야 덴버 된장치는 로트야지 용사레스라 간주에 착신기 왕기 아니 장부체 모두야 참로 덴버치 모두야 참로 아니 착보다 당연 왕기 야채야다마다 연구여라서 디 칼데니 저당 율지기 비기 미바 지거데니 겐조디 아니 랑규기 아니 마리바생이티 미시보 몽바티 왕키 로신줄로디 왕키 유니루 코란리아 아니 신줄로도 도딩기 로디 왕키 지그레스 다돔 디겨라다
And so we think about it well. We need to think about it well. When we think about it well, we can come to see that there's no real purpose for becoming attached to a particular thing or developing hostility toward other things. When we think about it well, we can develop equanimity that is free from anger and attachment and so forth. And when we see everyone equally without being subject to the partiality of anger, attachment, and so forth, then a way of communicating with others can truly be truthful and honest. And yet, on account of having anger and attachment, we cannot do so. And so, in what way or how do we become affected by anger and attachment? Well, you can say that, yeah, there is some role that external objects play in the development of anger and attachment. Yeah, it is related to some objects, but mainly the main factor is our own ignorance. Ignorance with respect to ourselves or ignorance with respect to other things. So ignorance, confusion, ignorance is an erroneous state of mind. It is making mistakes. It is in error with respect to objects.
데르다 딘자 다 타르투나 몽바드 셀고고연자 몽바디 비기 유지 아니 네루라야 신줄로도 슈니 아니 몽바드 레고연자 다 유지 네루 모트비 토네 아니 몽바 셀수티 다 산지기 추 임부디 티차가도스 라 산지기 추 임부디 티차가도스 딘자 추기 네루 가르레스 네땅 간다지 네인도라운디 아니 라왕도 마트비 땐인 좀 추기 여바디 아니 추남기 네루 임바디 아니 릭베기 톤 라 답직베드 펜션 마부슈치 장 아니 간주 용자게 피 톤데야기 아니 펜션 마부슈치 장디 아니 릭베기 람니 아니 네루 드야디 아니 산지기 다 아니 쉐텐수 다 라나메바디 디레샤스 라 라나메바디 디레샤스
And so at the end, what we need to do is to eliminate our own confusion, our own ignorance. We need to eliminate the mistakes that we make with respect to reality, our erroneous apprehension of reality. And to do so, we need to understand how things exist, what reality is. And this is the essence of the Dhamma that the Buddha taught. And so when we investigate how things exist, what reality is, well, we come to see that things do not exist independently, but they exist in dependence on and in relation to others. This is reality. And so in order to determine that, to assess that and determine that precisely, we use many reasons, logic, and also we use commonly accepted illustration and examples that illustrate that mode of existence. And so we follow a rational path. We follow a rational path for understanding the dependent and related nature of everything that exists, and that makes it an unsurpassed rational path leading to the understanding of reality.
어딜 딘상 안주다 산지 위치라야 동난치 제 가블라야 동난치 고서 쪼디 아니 심전탕 질라야 아니 세비삼바 고탄티 라 란다신 참말로 아니 세심을 때니 아니 조기여바 세비삼바디 아니 란신 참말로야 무슨 순전히 하장그 공고진지 임바디 nenga di samgoya ani nilugu tönde samgoya ta dinyi budi 심주지 dinyi tolaya samlotan rotuwana ani tegba chembowa dinji samlotan kansa di tegba chembowa seti chagwa sares.
And so in this way we develop some interest in the Buddha Dhamma. So interest in the Buddha Dhamma arises, and then we also develop an attitude of care for all sentient beings. So we proceed with a practice with increasing our ability to care for others, a sense of concern for others, for all living beings. And so when we increase our care for others, our concern for others, we also then think of the ways in which we could be of benefit to them, but also we consider how they exist, their reality. And so when we develop this way of thinking, we become a Mahayana person.
다들 ngode suro dadini nanganzu dini ma shong khaptu la ya shong ngos man drondi ani thakbu penzo dinza ngima login sra somba da genji chendu tarwanis kansa jigin phumbung hashi genji chebatar kansa je genji chegola ranshin ji tribi genji chepitsi ranshin chigdan tade kangron le mandashi tenika merikte ndada rangi sinyi tribi ranshin chiginani sendadan nami kansa tawo de 남이 때문에 지금 주시 된다는 천지 강사다부터 팅하루도 랑당 윤지비 강사
Shi
시팔 마송 교티스
Shiba maçon var gür. Shibar maçon var.
시팔 마송와 나가서리
Yema
시팔
Shivar maçon ve par.
생함의 강사다 남이 때문에 지금 비처 랑다 윤지비 생함의 강사다부터 마시팔 느끼원 교티 세디 강사다 남이 때문에 지금 비처 대단한 모론데 딱번 기회치데 자실레 가델 하데 메데나 대단한 딱번 기회를 시소스.
And so, after this general introduction to the subject matter of this text, we're now going to go back to the text and pick up from the point that we left off in the previous session. So, in investigating the way that we exist as person, the way that the self exists, we're refuting an inherent or independent person. And so in refuting an inherently existing person, we use the reason that refutes the person being one, or the person being, we looked at the refutation of an inherently existing person through the refutation of the consequence, the absurd consequence of the self, the person becoming one or becoming many. The third absurd consequence of the self existing inherently is the consequence of the selves being created and destroyed. And so the third fallacy, if the self and the aggregates are of one nature, reveals the consequences of the selves being created and destroyed. Just as the aggregates, which means the body and mind, which are asserted to be the same as the person, are created at birth and destroyed at death, particularly referring to the body, so too would be the person have to be created and destroyed. So when what is created and destroyed exists inherently, the person and the aggregates could not be anything other than the same or different natures, and yet both of these would be unacceptable. So if they were inherently the same, each established by way of its own characteristics, it would be as if the person of this and previous lives were the same without distinction. If that were the case, and you and the continuity of your previous life were the same, the person would have been born in this life without having died, because he would be inseparably one with the person you are in this life. It is unreasonable to make such statements, because the person would then be permanent. The fundamental treatise called Wisdom by Nagarjuna says, if that God were born as this man, such a person would be permanent.
대다디 다디 도도로지 가르친 거를 슬라운디 said ni ta pombo ni luse grwa nga da ni lu nimbo te ani chigla chig teni shawa imbala ya ani da di chigla chig ten su te ranshin ki chubareves pigi chi ani kanla ya madeba ani chigla chig temba ti chongware ani shenla tuni chigla chig temba ti shawares da shenla tuni chigla chig temba imbayna ani rawangi chupsu chig ta yungo marada shenla mademba chigla chig temba shawayna ta rawangi chupase da shenla mademba chigla chig temba yana ani chig chawrodos chig chabayna 아니 풍부 딩안주기 베나 아니 가정글루다 데리글루 예 캐번 조기여버디 만주 온섬 통고라서라 디난신기 아니 간주 제비값 그 소보다 로야 gem비 루니버디 교조기여버 온섬 통고라서 디난신기 아니 피기 텔레템비 나디야 아니 교딘디지 요리요 말이스
To put it in a nutshell, we investigate the sense of self that we have. So we think of me, I. We also think of my aggregate. This is to say, this is my body, right? So there is me and my body. And so how they're related to each other? Well, they exist in one depending upon the other. So one is related to the other. And as such, what we investigate is whether while one depends upon another, one is related to the other, do they exist in this way inherently? This is to say, independently, or do they relate to each other without being independent? And so if one relates to, if, for example, the I is related to the body, or the body is related to the self, this is my body, it is related to I, to me, then if it is related to me, then it is not independent. And so what we investigate is whether one can depend upon the other, one can be related to the other through being independent. And so if the self, I, and the body do not depend upon anything else, and yet they are related to each other, they will have to become the same. There will be one thing. And as such, when we think of, for example, the transformation that the body go through, well, we can agree that, for example, today's body is different to the one that we had yesterday, in that there's some transformation that the body went through. But also more, you can say more grossly, we can think of how our body was when we were during in our childhood, and how is it now when we're going through adulthood. So obviously the body is different, right? So if we think of the body and the self being independent, they do not depend upon anything else, and yet they are related to each other, they would have to conflate, they would have to become one.
다 당한 좀 풍분 교어줘야지. 풍분 교어줘야지. 깬지기 때문에 따로 깬 rakba지기 때문에 교어줘라다. 디 또니 쳐봐인 바디. 다 패션 통투 버러지. 단 아니 텔레템비기 나디 교어줘기 매바이나 아니 팅님부디 란싱기 찍레세디 갈도도스. 계지 교어줘기 여바이나 아니 나디 필 행기라야 라왕기 쳐번 따대야디 라왕기 쳐바디 마임바 콘 교어줘기 여바 또 여바디 디줍투고도스.
And so if they conflate, if they become the same thing, well, let's look at our body. And so our body does go through a process of change, transformation, and that transformation is occurring on account of conditions. So certain conditions affect our body, and our body transforms. If the self, which means I, me, and the body are the same thing, and the body changes, also the self will have to change. I will have to change. And therefore, it undermines the notion of the self existing independently, because we said that if the self exists independently, it doesn't depend upon anything else. It's not related to anything else. Conditions could not affect it because it does not depend upon any conditions. But if the self and the body are one, and the body is affected by conditions, we can also then undermine the position that the self does not depend upon anything else. The self is not independent.
Tenza du steba cheondigi ra manzuta rigbig tonida ani cheba cheondigi ngadi rawang chupsuchik zawa nini shatsul mebachik rigbi dugores ra the rigbi dugorda the rigbal ganda yobana ganda redini ko shachogor madata gawa maybe rigbajigi toni driwondige ani rawang chupsuchik zawa nini 아니 니기 매바 마세 라왕기 마드바티 니바니 토야지 용구연자 디 람라야다 티기어레스 디 람라야 티기체네 간지 네루 아니 내룩 최탐지 내룩디 라왕기 마트비 술디 아니 똑투에디 더 산기 듣는 것도 왔어 디치고레스
And so what we're doing here is finding reasons in order to prove that I do not exist independently, that the self is not independent. And so we're using a logical approach to that. And if the logic that we use can be invalidated, it is contradicted, it is invalidated, then of course we have to then agree that we're not approaching it in the correct way. But if we're using a logical approach, a rational approach, and logic cannot contradict it, then we would then have to surmise at the end of our investigation that we cannot find any sense of independent self. The self is not independent. This is the logical path that we follow in order to understand reality. This is what is real. What is real, what reality is that the mode of the self is not independent. This is what the Buddha taught.
there's ngoyo pigi raung gi trub deba chi ba na ani rigpa karmu kharsia ba na te drupthug marwas ra te drupthug mara di ngeba nya ji ho mara da.
So if in reality the actual way of being is independent existence, whatever we seek to prove through logic cannot be proven.
Di nimba na di da demba mai bi ke ja raung gi trub shen do raung gi meba res lam ro deba na ko demba mai bi sik chawanza ani khani mena khani ko zumba ji theng gres ro zungub roju theng gres the di meba di rigba khorang ton drugyat ro sanjom de songja se mai ba ti jinju gi ani chi lebe nam ji songja se mai ba khora rigba rang gi ton cheba chesu ten goya di ani pe mase ba keshembu sungu dos ra.
And so we are here attempting to prove that we and others do not exist independently. And so if phenomena such as ourselves and others do exist independently, and yet we make effort to prove that they are not independent, we're going to end up speaking something that is not true. If it's not true, it is false, which means that when the Buddha sought to prove that phenomena such as the self do not exist independently, and in reality they are independent, it would have meant that the Buddha did not speak the truth, that it was speaking a fallacy, falsity. So this is not, of course, this is not the case, but rather than saying that phenomena do not exist independently because this is what the Buddha said, or this is what the Indian masters have asserted in their writing, what we seek to do is to study this path of reasoning, but then to use it for ourselves and to reach our own conclusion. So it's not enough to say that it is like that because the Buddha said so. It is like that because the great masters have said so. We used to use that path of reasoning, that rational approach, and to reach a conclusion and to see for ourselves whether ourselves or other phenomena exist independently or whether they are empty of being independent.
sakche darwi session to labor talanga yaka lawar chai edamena ani nga junsen chini ta khubache go maris jinju doja cholya ta di sonya di da jomden di ta khechulane meba chi chagores.
The Buddha, the Bhagavan himself said in one of the teachings that he gave, do not accept anything that is said just because it was said by me and you respect me. Accept what I said only once you have investigated it, like you investigate a nugget of gold. So you might cut it into pieces, try to melt it in fire, scratch it or rub it to make sure that you have an authentic nugget of gold. This is really a peerless approach to the Buddha's teachings, investigating them with reasons.
다 생하시 두비 인 맞고서 생하시 두비 간사 랑기 칭이 주비 랑신 타데나 대니란 저모롱데스 다 집인 저 메디 대니 랑신 타디비치 대종긴 저 메디 대니 찍지 라레 방가비체데 랑신 기트바디 젠라 데 방가비체스.
And so the text continues in saying, if the persons linked together by former and later lives were of a different nature, existing by way of their own characteristics, it would be impossible for there to be any connection between them. There would be no relationship in terms of the causes and results of actions between each self, because they would both be of a different nature. Their arising would be unconnected, because they both being inherently different would contradict the dependence of one thing upon another.
대단라 균직빈 저와 샤도 무론디 대달란 저와니 카이메 비치 에 주발레 간다 란지니지 소소와 대다 균직 도바 링마인 셰소스.
As the inherent existence of one thing contradicts its being related to something else, it is inappropriate to posit a relationship between them, because they share neither of the two relations cause and effect or being the same entity. If persons were to exist inherently, they would have not to depend on anything else, but if something has a relationship with anything else, it must also depend on something else. And so Chandrakirti's supplement to the middle way says, whatever exists individually by way of its own characteristics cannot possibly belong to one continuity.
다지랑한디 야침부레마도 제와니 세대디 아니 상기기 추 나올이야 학돈도직 따왔대나 배배 가둘라 아니 제와디 개첨부슈 차그도스라 제와티 베나 다징제스라운디 아니 되네 샤바식 라 샤쇼다 누쇼세디 샤쇼 직면은 누쇼세디 용거 말아왔어 샤쇼를 되네 누쇼샤고리 누쇼된 샤쇼를 되네 누쇼를 되네 샤쇼 두스 되네 샤쇼큰 제와디 야 다징제스 라 데니 텐종세디 귤르뜨는 제분 종수티 규단 제부세디 규칙이 여반자 텔데미 제부샤토고 제부데 규칙면은 제부샤모토고 제부직면은 콜에 규스 탄이 통메바 어 딘지기 제와디 균제기 제와스 디니기 아니 네술디 산지기 추나야 조 디난기 따왔대나 파비카둘라 베케시무 송글로스.
And so in this section, we are investigating how phenomena relate to other phenomena. And the determination of relationship, the type of relationship, is discussed in some part of the Buddha's teachings. And this is an important understanding that one needs to develop in using the path of logic, how phenomena can relate to each other. So if phenomena are related, let's say if two phenomena are related, they can be related in two ways, or in one of the two ways. They can either be intrinsically related, or they can be causally related. And so looking at, for example, intrinsic relations, things existing relative to each other, like, for example, East and West. So we can have East only in relation to West, or we can have West only in relation to East. And so East and West are intrinsically related, and the relationship in terms of being relative to each other. So that's one type of relationship, relative relationships, which are intrinsic, have to do with intrinsic relations. The second type of relation is causal relations. So for example, two phenomena can be related in terms of cause and effect. So if causes exist, they can issue forth results, and a result cannot come to be without its corresponding causes. So this is a causal relationship. So in looking at the section that we have been covering here, in looking at the relationship between, for example, not only the self of the body, but also the self of this life and previous life, we have to then understand how do they relate to each other in terms of either cause and effect or intrinsic relationship.
Anzu tasalaya ndrewe korti pena drachuje madadi cheba imbichirse cheba di madabalaya ndretsuti ndretsu kolaya dawachik fi sobatsugres dolinche di korkita pande chodake zamanam de lewe tambuge anen kotelaya da sik nyoshi jore digidi ane tsawa digidi lolasem di kapdugo tan jewa mambu peyor da kiba mambu gitani songda ande zutalaya ane rigba shu tang yoyech rigba shu song tang yoyech dindi yores ra dindi chegores cheba imiches cheba matabal ndesu.
And so when we investigate the relationship between phenomena, how phenomena relate to each other, we use logical statements, what we call, something that is called syllogisms. So we use syllogisms such as, for example, take the subject sound. It is impermanent because it's a product. So in the early stages of Geshe studies, when he was at Sera Monastery and he studied for many years at Sera Monastery, 1 month was dedicated just for the investigation of the relationship between phenomena. So for example, take sound. It is impermanent because it's a product. And so you investigate how product or being a product is related to being impermanent. Product is related to impermanence. So the debate of just this topic took about 1 month. And so you study a text by Dharmakirti, a text that is an Indian scholar, Dharmakirti, that composed a text that is called the Pramana Vartika, the companion to the commentary to valid cognition. And the section of the text related to investigating the nature of relationship is quite succinct, it's quite short. But you study you have to memorize this part of the text. Then you have to look at a lot of commentaries given by Indian masters, investigating how phenomena relate to each other. And you take it on to the debate court in debating this material over 1 month. So it's quite extensive.
Tevda gün chig mayina kewa temba meteban gürshins. Tadi kewa tendinge mambu yungores. Tad gün chig mayina kewa ngama kandas tengores. Meteban gürshins.
And so, looking at the text, it says, if persons were not of the same continuity, recollection of past lives would be unacceptable. And so here the premise is in investigating what would occur if persons would exist inherently or independently. It would mean that they could not be related. For example, the person in this life and the person in past life could not be related because they are independent. Therefore, they could not belong to the same continuity, giving rise to the consequence of recollection of past lives would be unacceptable. And so we do have quite a few accounts of people that do have recollection from past lives. So if the person of this life and the person of previous life cannot belong to the same continuum on account of them being independent, remembering previous life would not be possible. If such were the case, it would contradict many sutras in which the Buddha recalled his previous life as a bodhisattva on the spiritual path.
Cindy Kansatawa, Hunji in Jebu, they do the launch of a tea, lay machebada, Tebran Judy. Tea you Korangi Masa, Korandan Junchi was Shingis, Sawa and shout maybe chair. Shout maybe chairs.
Even our own recollection of previous actions would be impossible if the self of today were inherently different from yesterday. And so moreover, the wholesome and the unwholesome actions that someone has done in his previous life would be dissipated, and he would not experience their outcome. This is because we cannot assert that his actions will be experienced by another person who is of the same continuity as himself. That would be like saying that a person meets in this life with the happy and miserable results of previous action without having done them. And so here, the point is that if the person exists inherently, we cannot also assert that karma or actions would work with that person, because there would be a disconnect between the person creating the action and the person experiencing the result of that action.
대단한 강사단 풍부 랑기 친이지 트비 랑신 찍발라 느시엔남 리비 람니 녜벌 쌀니 짱버 체데스 랑룰란 탄년도 강사단 풍부 온지도 켄란 그비 대단히 신도 타신 까위 내소스.
And so it says this would be like saying that a person meets in this life the happy and miserable results of prior actions without having done them. Because we cannot, we cannot assert that they are accumulated by another person of the same continuity as himself. It would follow that he had never accumulated their causes. Thus, having sought through the path of logical reasoning to ascertain the fallacies of the person and the aggregates existing by way of their own characteristics while being of the same nature, we would maintain this understanding. According to our own tradition, our own system, philosophical system, we must accept that the person and the aggregates are nominally the same entity, which is an extremely subtle and difficult point. If the person and the aggregates existing by way of their own characteristics were of a different nature, well, let's hold off with that for a second and see what Geshe says.
강사당 풍부랑기 친이지 트비 랑신 타데나 사실에 가든 풍부 남리시 풍부 친이 매번줄 시송바따르 풍부 뒤지스 쳔비 친이 genji nebersumda meden banjurdi ta 방랑 le ngong ta debi pensu chigle chigi tsenyi meden bashenos.
According to our own tradition, we must accept that the person and the aggregates are nominally of the same entity, which is an extremely subtle and difficult point. If the person and the aggregates existing by both their own characteristics were of a different nature, as Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle way called Wisdom says, if the self is different from the aggregates will have no characteristics. And so it says the aggregates would then lack the three characteristics of creation, abidance, and destruction, which makes them composite phenomena. They would be like a horse and an ox, which being of different entities do not share each other's characteristics. If it were so, that the aggregates in the person existed inherently, it would not be possible for them to form a composite phenomenon. In that case, there would not be an object of either the mode of apprehension or its aspect of the innate misconception of a self of persons, like, for example, space and the state beyond sorrow.
로션 대단한 뒤질수 모르면 Geshe 대단한 강사기 강사 그 당진 hin기기 민남이기 미버 모론데스 다 팅아티 페나 남카다 냔데셰노스.
So it says in that case, there would not be an object of either the mode of apprehension or its aspect of the innate misconception of a self of persons, like, for example, space and the state beyond sorrow.
젠양 퐁부 랑긴 퐁부 예메비 시 양아우 냠비 르 쩨마 마임바 키스버 교데 강사단 퐁부 랑기 칭이기 온타디 비치.
Moreover, if the person and the aggregates are of different entities in terms of existing but of their own characteristics, even if there were no aggregates at all as a basis, an uncontrived thought of I should arise without them.
페난디 순가라다.
Number
퐁부 예메비 시양 ngao nyambi lo chuma mayi ba kesi ban gyurdes. Nanzu mi deda tige, ani sukbun tong di, mi de tong song nyamba tang, pena susu gu lula ya chik chiong di, ngao nyambi lo chik yungo ras. Di ko ani chuma mayi ba chik. Ngangi ta ngao nyambi lo chik yungo ras. Dan pongbu deda, ani nga dang, nga kala tabi pongbu nipo di, reme tunshin chik yinbayina, reme tunshin chik yinshendu, an dindri ngao nyambi loji kigi yobayina, pongbu yeni meba, susu lubu zao nini mesaki, ani saji tabi shila ya, ani tongni ngao nyambi ki lo chuma mayinba chik kiye yoribes, di yomares. De, Canada di yongwa tadrogu dos. Kansan reme chikla ya, pongbu dang, ngani botin jeme tenjin chilaya ani phombol mene ngim phombo nyambi lo sikki yobana ani shambala yon chogros ti yong maris.
So the section says that let's look at the investigation of ourself existing inherently and how we would then relate to the body. And so if we as persons exist inherently or independently, and the body also exists independently, inherently, and we were different entities, would be completely unrelated to each other. So we and the body would be two unrelated things because we would exist independently. And that being the case, first of all, we can think of how when we see the body of someone, we can say that I saw that person, right? So we can say I saw that person when we see the body, or when we think about it in relation to ourselves. Then the thought of I or me arises in relation to our body, and so when we either touch the body or something happens to the body, we think of I or we think of me. So had it been the case that I would exist independently or inherently, and my body would exist independently and inherently, there would be then two unrelated phenomena, unrelated objects. And that then would have meant that it would have been possible to think of I in relation to a place or a situation where your body is not there. So think about, for example, a place where your body is not present. A thought of I would still arise in that place in relation to something, because the I inherently exists in I would be completely unrelated to the body. And so, of course, this is impossible.
Pernas the Bekarshan and the Jamaica pitch in and dinner Pomnum Monta Davis. Pombo may be Shea, Mambo Nyambata, Mambo may be Shea, Pombo Nyambi, Lochima Mayimbashi, Kiedo, Tinanshi, Yongo, Yongomadala, or the Kiwashenos.
And so the text uses an analogy in order to illustrate that. For instance, the vases being of a different entity from a piece of cloth means that even when there is no vase as a basis, we can produce the thought of this is a piece of cloth. And on the other hand, if there was no cloth as a basis, we would still be able to generate the thought that this is a vase without making it up. And so if the self, inherently existing self, and the aggregates would be also inherently existing aggregates or inherently existing body, would be different, they would be unrelated to each other. And therefore there would be like a piece of cloth and a vase. You'd be able to see one without the other.
Reda dodo zo di karisungo res laondi ninang la ya ngadangi pombos lara ngadangi pombo di dai yosul di kandashi res ngadangi pombo nimbo di damage do ani chig la ya döni yongdo ditayat ro damage ni yobaino ani yongdang singmodos kandashi ani ngi pombo singin chagres ro o dinji tolaya 다 tööni yobayna nganzu gi bigi nganzu semlaya ngi phongposlam di ngal bedi logaj imbagi nawanchi yodebadi chunna reshas ro dila warda
bed logasana
ngi phongposlam di ngal surti yobachi.
The point that is made here is with respect to investigating ourselves and investigating our bodies. So we think me, and we think of my body. So how do we exist? How do I exist? How do my body exist? Do they exist as being unrelated to each other? Or do they exist in relation to each other, independent upon each other? And so we cannot really think of, for example, me and my body as being unconnected or unrelated. We cannot conceive of ourselves and the body as being independent from each other. So if they are related, then when we think of my body, we have also to then connect it with I or me. They cannot be unrelated.
Tensa shele dani never lembale jendu teba nyemai kadeshana lemeba suyo rigna sondume jetans jugbale tishin pombulation da medi pombumato tenzema ducher Jesus.
And so the notion of the self and the aggregates, the self and the body as being unrelated or independent is mistaken. And so going back to the text, it says from Nagarjuna's fundamental treatise on the middle way called Wisdom, if it is not at all acceptable for the self to be other than the contaminated aggregates. For without the contaminated aggregates, even if you think there is something to be apprehended, there isn't. And to that, Chandrakirti's supplement to the middle way, explaining Nagarjuna's thought, says, therefore, there is no self apart from the aggregates, because the self cannot be conceived without depending on the aggregates. Thus, the person does not exist but with its own characteristics because it depends on the aggregates.
Rangi tsini tribe rangshin chik tang tadela neba lebar tones nga dang ngi pumbo niboti rangshin tribe chi amare rangshin tribe tade amare desha vayna ani rigbe neba dos these are rigbe neba lebar tonshi rangshin chik tade khando ya matribe tse kyabshi kane kyabsha dobi rigbe kansa rangshin mebi ten lebar toba seming about tension the dembe kyamwar chavos.
And so drawing the conclusion from this investigation, it says, accordingly, when you have properly seen the invalidity of the person and the aggregates being one or different in nature, which means that we investigate whether we exist inherently. If we exist inherently, we have to be either one with the aggregates or different to the aggregates, inherently one or inherently different. So it says, when you've properly seen the invalidity of the person and the aggregates being one or different in nature by way of their own characteristics, they're established as neither inherently one nor different, which means that we investigate whether we exist inherently. When we prove that we cannot exist as being inherently one with the aggregates, and we cannot exist as being inherently different to the aggregates, altogether we have negated the option of existing inherently. And through the reasoning which negates the pervasion of inherent existence, once the pervasive factor of being inherently one or many has been negated, valid cognition properly ascertains the lack of inherent existence of the person. This ascertainment should be nurtured through mindfulness and alertness.
Oh, 선생님.
Have
저는
you got any questions? It's pretty hard going, isn't it? Have you got any questions, either in relation to this or other things?
같이는 되겠어. 같이 하는 되겠어. 야, 어머니.
Yeah, so could Geshe speak a little bit more about the inabilities to speak honestly or freely? I think they said that in relation to with anger and attachment, where so could Geshe speak about it more? Dila, 그랑이 ngurtu chebe kapsula yang kares baresena kesi chadayona? Joseph? Long time no seen. How are you? All right. Randil page lo choose malene lo choose tos.
네.
차단 가서 차단 연하러 와.
잘라요.
차과단 당와요나. 아니
차단요.
차단 연하. 아니 참보 땅 모연에서 덴바셰투기 마레스. 디 바가치라 치라인 바. 디토라지 데시게토 아이나스. 망스
카드. 망스시에 카드시에 그래서.
So could Geshe speak more about it? You mean like now or? Yeah. Yeah, just a little bit.
아, 선생님. 그래도 내가 자신되게 랑신기 착부제사들이야 촉송혼로야지. 아니 콘트사사들이야 아니 촉송혼로야. 대랑식 차기도 하잖아. 네가서 용이 trou그라다라. 되게 아니 장부제 두고 매바디 자시자단 봐.
Well, Geshe said that anger and attachment are states of partiality, which means that anger is bad with respect to its object, and also attachment is partial with respect to its object. We can see that based upon our own experience. We can assess our own experience and see how when we get angry or when we have attachment, we are biased with respect to their objects. And that being the case, then we cannot really be honest or truthful in the way that we speak or in the way that we act if we are partial in relation to them.
레베는 안서 다만 콘트로 사사치. 여봐나. 아니 그 감바 조조 자하나 그 디고 사람마다 그 감바디하고 차셔서 세문이다. 안디즈로지 간지 다만께서 지 델미니 코 대화되는 지마로 냠비 로지에데 백하고 요래서 콘트로 사사 요대. 라. 아니 수수 착신 체사들이야. 아니 pena dinheiro da kanji.
And so thinking about, for example, how a mind is affected by anger, and we when a mind is affected by anger, we might say something to a person that is not that is not based on reality. It's like, Geshe said jokingly, like, for example, you can tell someone that has two legs that they have only one. Anyway, and so with anger, when a mind is affected by anger, when a mind is partial, we cannot be honest in relation to a person. Like, for example, when a mind is hostile toward another person, we cannot really wish them to have happiness and the cause of happiness. We cannot wish them to be free from suffering. And likewise, when we think of how a mind is affected by attachment, and thereby also becomes partial, in some sense, you can say that it's becoming too close to another person, and therefore, again, not being completely in line with reality.
참부 가진 말 레슬라운 딜라워다 아니 간주 대화대화도 동안도 지규레스 탐지 동안도 잘고 여바디 지버레스 있나야 계란 콘로사스 딜이야 대화되는 찌마로냐 로키 못해야지 디 참부 말레스 강갈 기나 개념 마지님 지규 조거마도 찌라 마지어디 디 참부 말레스.
And so how do we tie it up with not being honest when anger or attachment arise? Well, when we think of an honest or sincere approach to other living beings, everyone is equal in terms of wanting to be free from suffering and wanting to have happiness and well-being. And so not only everyone is the same in seeking happiness and well-being and wanting to be free from suffering, also everyone has the same right. And so when anger arises in our mind, we cannot wish that other person, the person that we are angry with, to have happiness and to be free from suffering. And so since we cannot really wish that for the person that we are angry with, the person that we are hostile towards, then we're not being honest, because we fail to recognize the equality of all living beings. And so with the sense of love for others, the wish for them to have happiness, if it arises, it needs to arise with respect to everyone equally.
동안 되게 균생지 동안 같은 찌마로 냠비 로드 끼고도 심장탐잖아 끼고도 디슨 거레스 디 카레스나 뭐요 네츠 피기 동안 되게 매바 인자 아니 뭐요 네츠던 팀비기 로직이야디 다 장부다 덴발레 찌고레스 그 뭐요 네츠던 팀비 로직이 마토야디 장부 마레스 디 가리 안드레스인데 차단거 안드소니 아니 딘지 무연에서 템비 로시키 무투고 소차도 딘지 차단을 투샤세 딘지 순구여서리스라.
And also when we develop compassion to other sentient beings, we wish them to be free from suffering. May they be free from suffering. And the reason that we use to wish them to be free from suffering is that we recognize that they do not want it. Because they do not want suffering, may they be free from that. And so if we use that reason because they do not want to have suffering, we use a reason that is in line with reality. They do not want it, and this is real. And when this is reality, then the wish for them to be free from suffering is an honest wish, it is a truthful wish. But then when a mind is affected by anger or attachment, and we cannot wish all living beings to be free from suffering, it means that it is clouded by this partiality and therefore becoming not honest.
Yes.
And Geshe hopes that it, yeah. Ruby? So in relation to being one with the aggregates or different from the aggregates, is that way of explaining it is given in order for us to experience something? Is that a question? All right. Yeah. All right. So I think that the question is, how can we bring it into a more practical level to assess that through our own experience? Yeah. Rather than keeping it just in really difficult academic discussion. Yeah. Dila pumbodan chik yamena pumbodan tadesea dilayan. Dito la Geshe na samlotan wa na pe kyasimbo kale kawachiro. Tadi kesi soso nyawa tone matewaina. Kesha dende chi yamena tade kyangan shewaina soso nyawa matewaina. Peshe tunda shipta wole tumi mares. Soso nyawa tone kande chiktago gres. Shetsun kasa kurang keshedi. Shetsama to shetsama imba soso nyonwa nyamnyon gomba kandechi gongo res. Peshe chiwa dingire.
Deda sheba zamayimba samlo dani ngeba nyech ngeba nyeba di yang semla ya tenwondi ta shi ni nyon sing lego sarwas mado she mugo ba sam mugo ba nyoya le di ngoyo ne tsukbi nyoya de kabo bero da
And so there is a certain order to the way that we progress. And so, first of all, we get an explanation, which has all those different words, and we discuss that. We need to think about it until we reach a conclusion. And the conclusion that we reach is basically we become certain with respect to the subject matter. And then once we reach that conclusion, we become certain, which means that we have ascertained that topic. We think about it again and again, and through that, we come to experience that. And so this is kind of the order that we proceed. And so if we're trying to generate the experience without having thought about it before in this way of formulating, it's impossible to really develop that actual experience. So to experience that, first of all, depends upon knowing how to formulate that using all those words.
제rumji tambujachen teba mantsal partu shonluk tamja tambash taman inzengu de nyamslang sedi tenda direndo asra tambu suzugi jang ni jang teni jangshe che samlo tang yani yang odu cheba na kansam jile ya ratriach ro that ratrizon that kanji ngeba nyechi yungo asres the deeds the nyong to trovachi yungo asres ro
Rinpoche Tsongkhapa said in one of his writings, first I sought extensive study. In the middle, all of this done to my mind is instructions for practice. And at the end, day and night, I worked hard in my practice. And so in saying that, Lama Tsongkhapa, in some sense, introduced or pointed out how we should approach that ourselves, through following the process of, first of all, kind of developing an understanding through studying, then contemplating it. And at the end, we develop an experience of that through meditation that is supported by the previous stages. All right, shall we leave it here for today? Thank you. And so we'll finish with the dedication verses, dedicating all the merit that we've accumulated together today. And so may the supreme jewel bodhicitta that is not a reason arise and grow. And may that which is a reason not diminish but increase more and more. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. In the land encircled by snow mountains, you are the source of all happiness and good. O powerful Chenrezig Tenzin Gyatso, please remain till samsara ends. Savior of the Snowland teachings and transmigrated beings, who makes extremely clear the path that is unification of emptiness and compassion. To the lotus holder Tenzin Gyatso I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the Sibyos moral way, who serves in the bountiful birth of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Majunnath's victorious doctrine, who mercifully accomplishes magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels. Several of myself and others, your disciples, please live long. Thank you.